Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of major developments in North Carolina politics and public policy. I'm Mitch Kokai, sitting in for Donna King this week, and we have another jam-packed week of interesting and exciting news developments to talk about. Joining me with some expert analysis and insight, we have a very good panel this time. First, we're going to introduce you to Donald Bryson, who is the President and Chief Strategy Officer of the John Locke Foundation. Brooke Medina is the Vice President of Communications for the John Locke Foundation. And joining us on the other couch, a couple of guest panelists. Very expert insights and analysis. We have Professor Andrew Taylor, who is a political science professor at NC State University. Jenna Robinson, who is the president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. Well, we thank all of you for joining us today for this interesting discussion. And we're going to be turning at first, as we always do, to what's happening with the legislature and the legislative developments over the course of the past week. A lot of action on Jones Street. But before we get there, we have to talk about the big story that took place involving the legislature, and it actually involves the court system more than the legislature. State House Speaker Tim Moore facing a new lawsuit filed against him by a fellow Republican and former Apex Council member Scott Lassiter. Lassiter accuses the Speaker of using his position of political power to break up Lassiter's marriage. So this story gathered quite a bit of attention, state attention, even some national attention. Donald, what do you make of this?
Well, I think in a lot of ways it's a mess. It's hard to see what's going on. Remember, we have to talk about this. These are allegations. We don't know. Obviously, Speaker Moore appears to deny these allegations, and we don't know what's going to come out as this case goes into discovery. But from a political standpoint, I'm looking at a few different things. One, from a practical standpoint, what does this do to budget negotiations? Is this a PR sort of nightmare that Tim Moore is living through right now, and does he speed up budget negotiations and just try to get out of town? And does that mean that the House concedes more things or not? I don't know. What does this do for the worst kept secret in Raleigh, which was that he was interested in running for Congress? Does he want to run for Congress going forward, or does he survive this and maintain his speakership going forward? We don't know. There are a lot of unanswered questions that could be affected over the next few months, but we joked a little bit off camera, Mitch, time really is a flat circle. If you're Speaker of the North Carolina House, you should stay away from a breakfast joint. There's Jim Black, and then, of course, now we have Tim Moore meeting at a Biscuitville in Raleigh.
And he did say that he did go to the Biscuitville.
He did go to the Biscuitville,
and did meet with,
but he didn't hand over a bag of cash at an IHOP on I-85.
And tell anyone, don't tell anyone we did this,
right.
Which we know is part of North Carolina's political past. Andy Taylor, I know that you're interested in the implications of this as well.
Yeah, just picking up with what Donald said, I think it has interesting ramifications for redistricting more broadly. Donald mentioned that Speaker Moore may have been interested in a congressional seat, while presumably would be in a good position to be able to affect the redistricting that we're going to have for congressional districts. But if he's not going to be interested in that personally, what does that do to that particular process? How does it do for his leadership of the House Republicans? You mentioned the budget negotiations. You could make an argument that it perhaps even strengthens the House's position, because he's going to turn around and say to Berger, perhaps, I might not be able to sustain a veto as easily now. People might perceive me as being weaker within the House Republican caucus. So, there are a lot of questions to be answered on this.
Yeah, we can say that we learned today from Speaker Moore, speaking in front of the other members of the House of Representatives. The House will be meeting next week, and they already know they're not going to finish the legislature's work by the end of June. No vote scheduled in the week of the Independence Day, the 4th of July, which means that we're going to go at least into the middle of July with this legislative session, and then redistricting at some point later this year. Well, while that was the big story, there's also plenty of action on Jones Street itself. Since we last spoke to you on the Debrief, Governor Roy Cooper has been pulling out the veto stamp over and over again. He's vetoed 4 more bills. One of them is Senate Bill 364, which deals with compelled speech in state government. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that a little later in the program. Others that were vetoed by the governor, one dealt with increased city and county compliance with audits, and some others dealt with consumer finances and retail installment sales. Some of those bills passed unanimously the first time around, but then after the veto, the Democrats, who are aligned with Governor Cooper, decided to help him sustain the veto, but the Senate still voted to override all those vetoes. That brings us to the tweet of the week. We saw that as this situation cropped up, NC Senate Democrats in their official Twitter account said it's shocking Senate Republicans would muscle through a veto override on a bill that would do nothing except drive up cost, et cetera, et cetera. You could read it there. Crazy was the last word they used. And then that generated a response from Republican legislative staffer Brent Woodcocks, who asked, "Is this you?" And then he highlighted the vote total that showed that one of the bills that was discussed, Senate Bill 331, passed unanimously, 46-0. 18 Democrats. There were 2 who weren't there, but all 18 who were there voted for that bill. So if anyone was being crazy, it wasn't just Republicans. Democrats were involved as well. Donald, what do you think about this?
Well, that's been the test since Roy Cooper has been governor about can he hold together all of the Democrats at one time, which Tricia Cotham sort of, when she switched parties, blew the lid off of that, right? And now I think we're up to, 6 veto overrides this session, which we haven't seen in a few years at the General Assembly. I think it's just sort of ridiculous right now. People talk about party loyalty and ideological loyalty, but people forget Roy Cooper is an excellent political fundraiser, and he can give a lot of money to legislative campaigns, and has. And so I think a lot of that loyalty stems from that. There's no functional reason for why Democrats or Republicans, that wasn't even a partisan issue.
Yeah, very interesting. A couple of major election bills also passing during this session of the General Assembly this week. On the state Senate side, they passed one bill that would make some major election changes, including requiring that ballots that are mailed in arrive by Election Day, no more 3-day grace period, and also a separate bill that would change the State Board of Elections, making it an even bipartisan split, and having the leaders of the legislature rather than the governor make those appointments. These bills interest you, Andy?
Yeah, they've caused a little bit of a stir with regards to changing the voting rather than the composition of the elections board. I do think it's interesting that it's focused on both in-person voting in terms of reducing the amount of time that there will be for early voting and mail-in ballots, and that's absentee voting. I've always thought that it would probably be a much better idea to keep those rules that we've relaxed a lot over the last couple of decades. I mean, a lot of Democrats think that this is the end of the world. Of course, we're just moving back a little bit in those terms compared to where we were in 2000. It's an incredibly relaxed approach. But I think that it'd be better for Republicans to focus more on getting people to the polls, and therefore be sort of hands off the early voting and be more hardcore on absentee voting, where of course there's more opportunities for fraud. And the National Republican Party is working very hard now in trying to focus on early voting and getting people to the polls. And this seems to be sort of counter to that strategy.
Yeah, lots of interesting things happening on Jones Street this week. We know also the Fairness in Women's Sports Act, which is the one that would ban biological males for participating in women's sports. That just passed the State House today, now goes to Governor Cooper. I would guess that veto stamp is coming out again in the not too distant future. We also know that there's going to be plenty of action on the budget. As we mentioned, budget negotiations ongoing, no budget expected in the next week or so. Let's go ahead and shift gears away from Jones Street now. Today, the John Locke Foundation released its latest Civitas Poll of likely general election voters in North Carolina. Brooke, tell us about the Civitas Poll.
Well, this is an exciting poll in particular, I think, because we get to focus on a topic that is near and dear to many of our hearts, which is capitalism. We believe that markets are able to better respond to the needs of consumers than government control, and it seems that the majority of North Carolina voters agree with us. So they identify as capitalists. They believe that is by far and away the best way to promote a healthy and robust economy. Right now, they're getting a lot of dour news about the economy. That's something else that our poll indicated. But in terms of how they identify, accepting the Democratic part of the electorate that we polled here, they identify as capitalists. So that's Republicans and unaffiliated voters, which are by far the largest voting bloc right now in North Carolina. So that's an encouraging sign. I mean, there are some that are pro-socialism, but that's all right. We've got time to persuade them and change their minds. One other part about this, though, thinking about capitalism and woke capitalism, the Bud Light drama, the Target boycott. So these are a lot of things that have been happening, particularly this month when there are a lot of companies that have been expected to speak out in support of LGBTQIA plus causes. President Biden has been doing this. Most consumers, though, and likely voters, they indicate they don't want their employers taking a political stance on these culturally sensitive hot topic issues. And so definitely not to somewhat no, that definitely takes the cake here when it comes to whether or not employers should speak out on this issue. So by far, most North Carolinians would much rather their employers, their politicians, sometimes in some ways, not pander to these particular issues and just do their jobs, provide great services to North Carolinians.
Jenna, that particular question that we just saw the graphic of has also caught your eye.
Absolutely. It's an issue that colleges and universities have been grappling with for a long time. In fact, way back in 1967, the University of Chicago issued a report on this issue called the Calvin Report, which essentially said institutions need to remain neutral because just like marketplaces of ideas work better if your major institutions don't take positions on controversial issues. And so going back to 1967, the University of Chicago doesn't take positions. And now here in North Carolina, the UNC Chapel Hill does not take positions. The Board of Trustees voted on that back in February of this year. But also now the issue is coming up in the General Assembly. Senate Bill 195, which is a UNC omnibus bill, now includes a provision that would say that colleges and universities must remain neutral on controversial issues of the day. And I think that would be very good both for universities, for administrators who are under a lot of pressure to make these statements, and for students and for the market of ideas in general.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. Another thing that we haven't yet mentioned from the poll was we asked the job approval for President Biden, Governor Cooper, which we always do, but also added this time around job approval for the 3 declared candidates for governor who have current Council of State jobs. We did not ask about Mark Walker, the former congressman. He does not have a current elected post, but we asked about Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, the Treasurer Dale Folwell, and the Attorney General Josh Stein. Just very briefly, Robinson's approval versus disapproval, 34-24. Stein approval versus disapproval, 27-18. Folwell approval to disapproval, 18-12. A lot of them, especially Stein and Folwell, seem to have a lot of people who don't have an idea one way or another how they're doing in their job, Andy.
Yeah, so the 50% or more for Folwell and Stein are DKs or unsures, which is kind of interesting compared to Robinson, Stein and Robinson comparison, because you'd think the Attorney General, he's been there for a long time. The Attorney General, with all due respect to the Lieutenant Governor's position, tends to have more to do. He's certainly been more in the news with regards to work-related matters, but it's because of Robinson's sort of star appeal, I guess. Some of the statements that he's made have generated a lot of news. That's why, the DKs or the unsures are less than 50% for him on his job approval. All of them are about 6 or 10 percentage points above water, which is, I guess, a wash. But it is interesting that fewer people seem to know what they think of Stein's job than they do Robinson's.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Donald, we've talked about some of the major pieces of the poll already. What else on there should we be thinking about?
Well, this is largely about what do people think about people in executive positions, including the president and the governor. And then we asked a lot of questions about, sort of this ESG movement that we're seeing among corporations and capitalism. What was struck by me is that by and large, people are pessimistic about the direction of the country. They're pessimistic, or they say that they're hearing negative news about the economy. And then when you say, hey, should the government or individuals have more control of the economy, a strong majority of people say individuals. And so I think that the 24-hour news cycle and people in D.C. and Raleigh, for that matter, think that there's a government solution to everything. And voters are saying, no, I don't think that's the case. I don't think there is a government solution to everything. I think that I and my neighbors and my employer probably should have more control over the economy than the mess that you all are creating.
Yeah, the actual numbers on that, 63% saying individuals should be the ones to have more control over the economy versus 27% for the governor. And also on our capitalism front, 58% say that capitalism leads to greater innovation and progress compared to just 18% for socialism. And in terms of whether capitalism or socialism is tied to the American dream, it was 66% capitalism, 18% socialism, which has to be some good news. We'd like to get that 18 even lower, I would think.
Sure.
Well, now let's shift gears back to, we've already talked a little bit about it, but back to election 2024. We aren't even halfway through 2023 yet, but a lot of people are already thinking about the next election cycle. And Andy Taylor, we know that North Carolina is going to be a major state once again in the elections, not only for our 16 electoral votes, but also this high-profile governor's race. What are you watching?
Yes, well, the governor's race will be important. We're on the presidential cycle for governor's races, so there's only a half dozen or so states that have the same cycle as us, so that automatically we get a lot of attention because of that. We've got a governor who is term limited under the state constitution, and so we've got an open seat. It's interesting how we're having a sort of reflection of the past, though. The Democratic Party has had sort of a conveyor belt from Attorney General to nomination for governor. You serve a lot of time as the Attorney General, as Roy Cooper himself has in the past, as Mike Easley had in the past before he became governor, and then you get the nomination.
Yeah, Bev Perdue was the break from that, but
yes,
she only got one term.
Right, and she only got one term. And then on the Republican side, it does have a feel a little bit like it did in 2020, where you had a lieutenant governor who had a sort of rocky relationship with the sitting governor, Democratic governor, who was known as a sort of conservative firebrand as the favorite. And of course, that didn't work out well for Republicans in the general election, with Cooper winning by about 4 percentage points. But it does have that sort of echo. And at the moment, it doesn't seem as though Robinson has too much of a challenge for the nomination, if you look at the polls, compared to Congressman Walker and Dale Folwell. He has a handy lead. Of course, a lot can change before the March primary, but that's sort of where the governor's race stands at the moment, I think.
Yeah, and we also saw some video of Republican presidential candidates hanging out in North Carolina. We saw Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, all here for the convention.
Whoever did the booking for the state Republican convention, someone should hire them for some, to bring other people to the state. I mean, we could get stars here all the time if that person was in control. And there's nothing particularly North Carolina-y about the Republican presidential primary at the moment, where the rest of the country is roughly all the other states, sort of 50% Trump, about 30% DeSantis, the rest sharing. There's going to be some dynamism there, obviously, with the new entrance into the race, particularly former Vice President Mike Pence. We've got two neighbors, obviously, in Nikki Haley and Tim Scott. I don't know whether they're going to be able to get some traction here because they're from the neighboring state. Be very interesting to see what happens.
We've been talking about the Republican side, but I know that, Jenna, one of the things you're following with the presidential race is something that our incumbent president, Joe Biden, seems to be relying on as part of his reelection bid.
Absolutely. I think it's pretty clear that one of Biden's tactics to win over younger voters is his student loan forgiveness proposals. It appeals very strongly to college graduates, especially kind of middle-income college graduates. This is an important demographic, especially women college graduates. And so doing that loan forgiveness is, a way to win over those voters, or, bribe those voters to come out and reward the candidate that gives them some free money. And so I think I'm watching that very closely. Obviously, there's a court case on that issue. And so it'll be interesting to see if that actually plays out, that, voters do reward Biden for that gift.
Yeah, very interesting to watch. Brooke, I know you pay a lot of attention to politics and what's going on here in North Carolina and nationally. As you look ahead to 2024, what are you thinking about?
I'm wondering about voter fatigue. quite frankly, and just the
You mean
theatrics.
the fact that we're talking about 2024 when we're only
Correct.
halfway through 2023?
I think people are ready for just some sanity, especially these centrists. I mean, oftentimes what we hear on social media, what we see on the news headlines is this hyper divisiveness. It's this ultra partisanship. But I would say by and far, most voters are just somewhere kind of in this thick middle. It's just they don't get all of that attention. And so there is this rewarding of to be as bombastic as possible. And so oftentimes the polling does indicate that these sort of larger than life figures that have this presence about them certainly are doing well. There is a sort of charisma that draws people to them. But when I'm thinking about the role of government and how elected officials are really supposed to just govern, I think most voters care about that. And so it's a matter of seeing whether or not these presidential candidates, the gubernatorial ones, can have a charisma about them that draws a voter to them, but also has a steady hand and sort of just this vision, sort of like Ronald Reagan when he started pitching this Morning Again in America, and even Donald Trump in 2016. It was a Make America Great message, Make America Great Again. And so it's just, I think that regardless of what you think about those candidates or their presidencies, that is, there's this, even Obama, hope and change. People are looking for something like that. So I'd be curious to see if that sort of message really emerges and takes flight in 2024.
Interesting. Donald, your thoughts on 2024?
I think voters are fatigued, and I think they're going to have to get over it because we're not going to not be a battleground state anytime soon. North Carolina, it's a fascinating state from a demographic standpoint, where our large urban centers are turning more blue, but our rural areas are turning more red. Particularly the coastal areas where a lot of people are retiring are bringing a lot more Republican voters. And so while Democrats and their counterparts on the left and special interest groups and PACs and 527s continue to throw millions and millions of dollars at the state of North Carolina, they've not been able to crack through. And we saw that with break the majority, talking about the legislative majority in 2018 and in 2020, and they wanted to break the supermajorities or prevent the supermajorities in 2022, and they just continue to run into sort of this Republican circle saw in North Carolina. But I think they're going to keep doing that in 2024 and 2026.
We haven't talked about the sports betting legislation yet, but I bet that it's a safe bet that we'll be talking more about the 2024 election a lot on the debrief as the year continues and as we get into 2024. But let's shift gears now back to the General Assembly and issues that deal with higher education. We've already touched on some of them, including the recent veto and the Senate override vote for Senate Bill 364. But Jenna, as the head of a group that focuses almost exclusively on higher education policy, what are you following on Jones Street?
Well, I'll start with that one, Senate Bill 364. That deals with two issues, both compelled speech and mandatory diversity trainings. And that bill, the first part of it codifies what the UNC Board of Governors has already done, which is to prohibit compelled speech in hiring and in admissions, and really for all employees. And that it does include mandatory DEI statements. So it means universities can't ask anymore about what your activities have been related to DEI, or what is your position on DEI, or any other controversial issue. They can't ask you to swear that you're not a communist. Not that they would, but now they can't. And so the bill would codify that and also apply it to community colleges and all government employees, and also prohibit those trainings. And as you said, the governor has vetoed it, the Senate has already overridden it, and so now we're just waiting for the House on that issue. Some of the other important bills that are going through include the NC REACH Act, which would make civics education a requirement for graduation at both colleges and universities in North Carolina. That bill handily passed the House more than a month ago and has been sitting in the Rules Committee of the Senate, and my only guess is that it is caught up in all of these negotiations that are going on. Similarly, Senate Bill 680 is a very important one for all of our colleges and universities. It deals with accreditation. Now, accreditation means that universities are kind of licensed by these federal agencies, or agencies that are licensed by the federal government, to be able to receive student loans. And so it's a really important gatekeeping body. Now, this bill says that our institutions would leave their current accreditor, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, choose a new accreditor, and going forward, have to change accreditors every cycle. And the reason this is important is, one, because the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools is the worst accreditor in the country. And two, because we don't want our institutions getting too cozy with their accreditors. We want the accreditors to actually do their job, to provide meaningful oversight. And if you've been in a relationship with the same accreditor for 50 years, that oversight is not really happening. And so that bill started out in the Senate, and we're waiting to see what's going to happen on the House side. Some other things that are important are included in the budget. There is $2 million in both the House and the Senate budget for the proposed School of Civic Life and Leadership at UNC Chapel Hill. And there's another interesting one from kind of a fiscal standpoint for our university, and that is the Faculty Retirement Incentive Program. That is included in the Senate budget, it is not included in the House budget, and it's an important priority for the UNC system because we have 5 institutions that cannot meet their enrollment goals. And so they have faculty, but not enough students to fill those courses. And so the solution that they want to propose is that they will give faculty incentives to retire rather than having to shed other positions. And so that's another one that we're watching.
Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff. You were an employee at the University of North Carolina system at NC State. The General Assembly could do a lot that affects what you're up to.
Yes, and Jenna just described all of it, right? I mean, so yeah. Just sort of thinking a little bit about how that affects my daily life. The mandatory DEI trainings are really interesting. I mean, I do think to a large extent it's kind of a kabuki dance, those kinds of things. There are a lot of faculty who probably sort of sit there and check the boxes and go on. Even people who on different sides of the issue sort of go through those kinds of things. So as a practical matter, I'm not sure how much effect they will have. One of the things that I do think legislators cannot address in regards to these kinds of things, though, is when you're talking about hiring faculty hire faculty, and you can prevent them from asking all sorts of questions. But we do know that disproportionately in many disciplines, in many campuses, vast majority of the faculty have personal politics that are to the left of center. And if they want to inject I'm not saying they do it all the time, and many of them don't, but if they do want to inject their politics into the process, then we've got the inevitable outcome is that they sort of perpetuate themselves, and there's nothing legislators can do about that kind of stuff. And I know that's the kind of thing that people do want to address, but it's very difficult to do it through legislative power.
Well, very interesting topics, and we know that this is something that the General Assembly is going to be continuing to work on. As Jenna mentioned, some of this stuff is tied up in the budget, and the budget is continued to be tied up in negotiations between the House and the Senate. As we said earlier, we learned from House Speaker Tim Moore just today that the House knows it's not going to finish its work by the end of June. They're not going to be taking any votes the week of the 4th of July, so that means that there will be legislative action at least through the middle of July. Well, you don't have to wait to the middle of July to stop watching this particular program. This is all the time that we have for this week's edition. We hope you liked it. We hope you will subscribe and follow Carolina Journal on social media, and that you'll visit carolinajournal.com throughout each day for the latest on North Carolina politics and public policy. Thank you for joining us, and please join us again next week for another edition of The Debrief.